So we know how to make our lights. This is the scene that you have. I'm going to make some quick lights here. Again, I'm going to use a target spot. I'm going to drag out my target spot so that my target is right on my tank. Because I dragged it out in my top viewport, my spotlight is actually in the ground, which isn't going to work very well. And I'm going to need to zoom out a little bit more here because I want my spotlight kind of far away. There we go. And I'm going to put the spotlight in this case over here just to, again, up in the top right corner of my scene. That should make so my shadow spills out right in this area here. And I'm going to hop over to my parameters with my light selected. And I'm going to jump down here to my hot spot and fall off, and I'm going to adjust the fall off a little bit so that I don't have a ton of fall off. So you can see here I've got a real low fall off, not much room between the hot spot and the fall off here. And I'll go ahead and render this, see what we've got, and that's what we've got so far. I think what I'm going to do is, instead of pushing the light back, I'm going to make the fall off a little bit wider because I don't want that border there. And a little bit higher. There we go. Okay, I think that'll work. We won't be too picky here. Okay, now we're going to talk about these shadows that are going to be cast by this as soon as I say use shadows, shadows on. We're using a shadow map in this case. And if I render it again, we'll see a shadow being cast down here. The object is self-shadowing. In other words, it's casting shadows on itself. That's fine for what we're doing. But I want to play with that shadowing that's on there. Now we can do that a number of different ways. The easiest way to do it is to actually add lights to tint the shadow or to lessen the shadow's effect. A shadow is where light doesn't hit, so it's going to be dark most of the time. But if we add another light to the scene, like an omni light over on the opposite side of our tank, so this is directly opposite, right about there. You can see it's directly opposite the tank. And with this omni light on, if I render my scene, I'm going to blow out a lot of that shadow. See, that doesn't look right. It looks like it's lit evenly, but there's a shadow. That's because the omni light I added is too bright. So I'm going to go under the omni light, intensity, and under multiplier, I'm going to bump this way down to about, here, I'll use an even number. How about 0.5? There we go. And I'll render that. And now you'll see the effect of the omni light is lessened, but my shadows aren't as dark. And that's usually what we want. We don't want to blow out all of our detail in the model that we made so that no one can see it, but we want to lessen the effect of the shadow a little bit. I'm going to go to 0.3 because I'm talking. I think that'll look better. So that we can still have shadows, but we're still seeing parts of the tank that we worked so hard to make. And that's very normal in life, is ambient light, different light sources are always going to be bouncing light around. It's very rare that you only have one light source in a scene. Now I can also tint these lights a little bit. This omni light, which is tinting my shadows, I'm going to make a very light blue. And this spotlight, which we're going to assume is something like our sun, I'm going to make a little bit more of a bronze color. Oops, wrong viewport. And I'll render this, and you'll see some slight tinting of the scene. May not be real obvious in the video. I have a feeling it's not going to be. But my shadows now look a little bit cooler, and I've got some tinting here like sunlight on my tank itself. Now I'm not real happy with the shadows in that scene. They're a little bit blocky to the tank itself. So I'm going to move my light over a little bit. here's a before, you'll see that this is kind of blocky to where the tank was. This view is going to give it a little bit more dimension. I'm getting a shadow kind of creeping back here along the back. A little bit better. Now let's talk about these shadow types that we've got. I'm going to go down here to, always have to remember where it is, shadow parameters. Here's my shadow's color under shadow parameters. Right now it's set to black. I can change that if I want to a blue. Not going to be very realistic, but you can change it. You can see everywhere that's being cast a shadow is going to be blue. So it's the cast shadow, not the shadows, not all shadows, it's the cast shadows. But you could set this to a slightly darker blue if you wanted to. I tend to leave it right down here around black. We'll render that again, you'll see the difference. So that's about what I usually set it as, but if you want to set the color, that's where it is. The density is here. You can lower the density if you want, and if I re-render this, you'll see that I now have a lighter shadow. Sometimes we lower the density in special occasions, but for the most part we want the density to be around 1, because it's going to blow out and make our scene look a little bit less contrasty and not quite as realistic. So that's density. Now, we can, under shadow map parameters, so now I'm under shadow map parameters, down here, wrong one, shadow map parameters, we can change the bias, the size, and the sample range. Now, because we're using my mind just went blank. Because we're using a shadow map, these become a little bit more important. A shadow map is Max's way of rendering a shadow kind of like a bitmap. So it's treating the shadow as if it was a bitmap, and you can get kind of blocky sides to it. We're going to do ray tracing here in a second, but for now, let's talk about this bias. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change these numbers a little bit. I'm going to bump the bias up to about 5. We'll render that. And you'll see what's happened is it's kind of scooted the shadow away from the tank. The bias doesn't need to go up or down too much, usually. I'm going to leave this at 1. The shadow side, I'll re-render this so you'll see that it'll go back under the tank. It kind of sticks the shadow back where it's supposed to be. The size I'm going to decrease first. I'm going to make this 128 and render this. And watch the edges of this shadow. See how they get really blocky? They kind of are blurry, but right here they're really blocky. That's the same thing as shrinking an image map down, and you get really blocky details, where if you add pixels, in this case, the default was 512, so I'm going to go with 1024. Watch the edges of this shadow map now. They're going to get much sharper. See how that looks much sharper? At a certain point, it doesn't do any good. I think 2048 may be a bit overkill here. I don't think we're going to see much difference here. Yeah, a little bit sharper, but you get the idea. The bigger the shadow map, the sharper the shadow, or at least the more exact what you're doing to the shadow will be. In this case, we haven't done much yet, so I'm going to go back to 1024. Sample range, I'm going to bump this way up to 12. Render this. The sample range is like adding a blur to the shadow. Now the sample range and the size work together. If you just add more sample range to a model, but don't up the shadow map size, all you're going to do is get blocky, blurry detail, where now I've got probably a little bit more, well, that's too blurry, I think. How about a 20? I think this will look a little bit better. A little bit more realistic detail. There we go. In that our shadows wouldn't be exactly sharp most of the time. So that's how those different settings are going to help you with your model. So remember sample range and size especially. Now, I'm going to go back all the way up here to the top. We're going to talk about ray trace shadows. So instead of shadow map, I'm going to drop this down to ray trace shadows. And I'm going to render this. And the difference is going to be that I'm going to get a much more exact shadow, but it's going to be a little bit sharper. And there you can start to see it coming in. It also takes longer to render. This is the default way in which, well, I shouldn't say default. This is the way that Max calculates shadows, so it's very exact, usually. We'll let this render through. Ray trace shadows are going to give you a better level of detail, but they are going to be sharp most of the time, at least by default. We don't get too much into lighting in this first class. Hopefully there'll be a second class and we can talk more about lighting. There we go. So those are your ray trace shadows. A little bit more exact, take longer to render. You can play with these different shadow types if you want and see what the differences are going to be. Some of them you're really not going to notice too much of a difference. This one's advanced ray tracing. Again, a little bit sharper, I think. Hard to tell. This is the mental ray shadow map. No, that one's not going to work because I don't have mental ray on. That was dumb. And area shadows. Well, area shadows don't seem to want to work right now. But stick with your shadow maps and your ray tracing. Those are the two main ones. You can mix them together in your scene if you want. So play with those and see if you can get your shadows to lie where you want them to. And we're going to come back to shadows in the next one as well.